I'm Paul Sullivan, your host of the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, sublime, strange, and silly aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men who are the primary parents, whether they work full-time, part-time, or devote all their time to their children, feel they have to hide or at least not talk about their roles. One thing I know from personal experience is being a lead dad is not a traditional role for men. Parenting is so often left to mothers or paid caregivers. But here at the Company of Dads, our goal is to shake all that off and create a community for fathers who are lead dads and for other dads who want to learn from them. Today, my guest is Dana Suskin. Dr. Suskin is an acclaimed pediatric surgeon at the University of Chicago. She's an expert in cochlear implants for young children. She's also the author of 2 best-selling books, 30 Million Words, Building a Child's Brain, Tune In, Talk More, Take Turns, about the beneficial impacts of parents having conversations with their children. And this spring, she wrote Parent Nation, Unlocking Every Child's Potential, Fulfilling Society's Promise. It's an important book, the type of book that aims to create real change for parents and children in this post-pandemic world where work and family are intertwined. And she knows of what she speaks. She has 3 children and a blended family of 8 kids. Dana, welcome to the Company of Dads podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I mean, be honest, you know, when you were growing up, did you watch 8 is Enough? Was that like your favorite TV show?
Actually, I really love the Brady Bunch. I used to dream that I would.
There are only 6. There's only 6 in the Brady Bunch. That's nothing.
I had to beat the 6. I always dreamed of being adopted as like the 7th one, but yeah, we watched 8 is Enough as well. So yeah.
Wow. Okay. You know, you literally do surgeries that give children the ability to hear. Every day you operate, you make the world better for people. So, you know, light first question. I mean, was there a moment when you were choosing hobbies and were weighing, you know, write a couple of best-selling books that will help people make families stronger and change the world, or maybe like take up tennis or contract bridge? I mean, sit out on the couch, watch Netflix. I mean, how did you branch out into writing not 1, but 2, you know, very important, impactful books?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. But actually, I view my work as an author, as a translational research scientist, really just as an extension of my work as a doctor. It is the necessary things, components that allow my patients to thrive. Because the truth is, all my work at the TMW Center that I co-direct at the University of Chicago, my books all relate to what is it that children need to reach their potentials and to thrive, whether or not they're deaf patients that I care for and provide cochlear implants or typically developing children. Really, what is it that all children need to thrive? So it's all part and parcel. It's not a hobby.
I know. So you do still sit on the couch and watch Netflix like the rest of us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. With my 18,000 children.
Or you just binge watch, you know, repeats of the Brady Bunch and 8 is Enough, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Your first book, you know, 30 Million Words, talked about, among other things, literally talking, you know, specifically the relationship between early language skills and brain development in children. I mean, that to me, you just said seems to come out of your work as a surgeon, but you know, when it comes to parents talking to their children, I mean, here at the Company of Dads, we're talking about lead dads, you know, fathers talking to their children, could be any parent though. Is there a certain type of talking that means more, you know, for example, is reading to them better than a dinner time chat, or talk about how those, you know, those words and what gets said to those children, you know, matters when it's coming from a parent or presumably a caregiver?
Absolutely. So really much of my work is focused on the first years of life, the first 3 to 5 years of life, when 85% of the physical brain is grown. People don't really think about it, but when we're born as babies, our brains aren't fully developed, unlike your heart and lungs. And the brain is waiting for instruction guides from the world, from nurturing caregivers to finish off the job. It's almost, some people call it the 4th trimester. And it's nurturing talk and interaction that actually help wire up all those billions of neurons to form the infrastructure of your brain development that allows you all your thinking and learning later on. And so what is the most facilitative language in the early years? We've actually culled it down at the center that I co-direct to what we call the 3 T's: tuning in, talking more, taking turns, even though, you think it's just number of words, but it's not. It's really that serve and return. So tuning into what your child's interested in, talking about it, using rich language, and taking turns, having a conversation. So it's as much quantity as quality as interaction. And that's the best way to build your baby's brain.
So when you talk about taking turns, I mean, it's one thing, I definitely get a lot of serve and volley with my tween. She's 12, coming on God knows what. So there's plenty of taking turns there. But when you're talking about a small child, and that, I think what you're saying, but maybe in layman's terms would be sort of that the final wiring of the brain and wiring some of those neurotransmitters. What does taking turns look like when you're talking to I have 3 kids, a small little blob that kind of, you think, is that child smiling at me, or does she have gas? I don't know. So what is taking turns like, real kind of rubber meets the road stuff for parents?
No, I mean, obviously it changes as the child gets older, but at the very beginning of life, people are always like, well, how do I have a conversation with my baby? They don't even have any language. And it can be anything from, gestures, pointing to looking, to obviously responding to words, but it's really about responding to sort of the communication that the child is trying to make with you. Obviously, over time, they start having words to go along with it, and then sentences, et cetera. But really knowing that it's that engagement, that the serve and volley or serve and return, that is so critical for that wiring.
And this book came out, 2015, 16, somewhere?
Yeah.
So, okay.
2015.
But, I think you and I have talked about this in the past. For one of my books, I interviewed a colleague of yours at Chicago, James Heckman. Won a Nobel Prize for something completely obscure, but has done remarkable research on, early childhood education. And quickly summarizing, comparing apples to apples, he found that, poor kids who had high quality early childhood education did better than poor kids who didn't have that. And of course, rich kids who had that same, they did better because they had more supports. But it was inspiring because you saw that this early childhood could help close that gap a little bit for these. That research was done decades ago, and we're still having these conversations today. How do you get it so that people understand that, the money that you're investing in your children, if you're going to spend it, you should really spend it in those early years and not wait to pay, private school tuition in high school, or hope that you'll send them one day to the University of Chicago and pay for that tuition, that those early dollars mean a lot.
No, and the beauty of Jim Heckman's work is, as you say, the fact that for every dollar that you invest early on, right, and it's not just, it's for all children, you get a societal return on investment of $12, right? So everybody talks about, the cost of different policies when they're sort of missing the point that you save money, right? It's a negative cost because investing early on not only improves educational trajectories, but you have a stronger workforce, decreased healthcare costs. I mean, nobody thinks about the fact that obesity, hypertension, diabetes, these things that cost society so much money are related to also what happens early on. And so, why are we still having these conversations? I mean, there are many different ways to answer this question. But what is quite clear from COVID-19 is that, if not now, when? I mean, right. Such an outlier compared to any other country in terms of investing in the early years. Although I do want to make the point that the story isn't that, only invest in the early years and forget about later. I mean, it's sort of like, it's, you have to start early, but, continue. It's not like with our children, we would invest in the first 3 years of life and then stick them in a closet. I mean, education is a continuum, but we've missed the mark in that for any child, there's a vacuum of supports in those critical early years, which makes no sense at all.
And just in my defense, I wasn't advocating some new Chicago school of parenting in which, age 8, invest, and then have at it, go for it. But the point here being is that, once you get to kindergarten and first grade, there are structures in place. Now, those structures broke down during COVID-19, but we didn't sort of foresee that. There are no structures in place between age 0 and 5 when you go to kindergarten.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, although, they're starting with the pre-K for sure, but the neuroscience, which has become clearer and clearer, is that learning and brain development doesn't start on the first day of school, but the first day of life. And while our country was just at the forefront of public education as the great equalizer, and it really was why we, were, last century, at the forefront in terms of nations, but now we're sort of, because of not keeping up, we're going to ultimately potentially pay the price if we don't start investing earlier.
Yeah. I want to spend most of our time here on your current book, Parent Nation. It's, I've read it. I was fortunate enough to read it early on. I mean, it's a movement making book. And you're going to win a lot of awards for it. But if there's ever an award for the best timing in the world, like coming out of, COVID, as people try to figure out what's next, how did the idea come about? Was this something you started working on, pre-pandemic? Because I mean, right now I can see there's such an appetite for a lot of the stuff that you talk about in the book.
Yeah. So, after my first book, which really looked at the individual level, what is it that children need that parents and caregivers can provide, right? What does the neuroscience show? And that book, plus the work at the center, really works at the individual level of working with families. And this is, back in 2015, 16, and just working with more and more families way before the pandemic. What became clearer and clearer was that we have this powerful science. Parents want to embrace it, but I just saw barrier after barrier being placed in front of so many of the families that I work with on the south side of Chicago and across the country. And so the idea had been percolating, honestly, just the fact that how is it that we have this powerful science? We've got this huge economic case, but we sort of leave parents on their own in the early years. And so I'd started thinking about how can we use that neuroscience to chart a pathway forward for our country societally, so that we better align what we do in support of families. And, I was thinking a lot about the families that I work with, especially from low income backgrounds. And then so I'd been thinking about it, then COVID-19 hits and you're like, oh my gosh, right? It's what is so clear is that it was like an earthquake that showed us how shaky our infrastructure of supports for all families was. And so I was like, you know what? I want to broaden the lens, because it's not just, obviously the families I work with are most impacted, but all families in this country, except for, those who have so many resources that you can close the gap on your own. And so I think that I started before, but really when I was writing during the pandemic, it just accelerated that this needs to be a whole societal, reframe in some ways.
And when the pandemic hit, were you still able to perform surgeries, or did things pause?
So some of the more, non-emergent cases, the elective cases were put on hold for sure. And we had to we had different strategies of saying, what needs to go earlier. But, I remember in the early days being on call and having to perform a tracheostomy on a relatively young guy who got COVID-19 and his wife had just died. It was a pretty sad and upsetting period. So, I mean, it's still pretty tough, but.
Yeah. But that was kind of the short question into the longer question, which was, as you said, the first book was more about individuals and individual agency, but this is these societal forces, or what we call, sort of some systemic, biases against people. Having done the research, having been able to really see firsthand, the whole world to see firsthand this sort of disparity between people who could afford childcare, people who could work from home and afford childcare, people who could at least work from home and didn't have childcare, and then of course all the essential workers out there who couldn't work from home and either could or could not, afford childcare. What were some of the big takeaways that you had? Like if you had like two or three, this has to stop. Like this is something that we can do now to get us closer to, a more productive parent nation, to sort of acknowledge that, the majority of people are parents or caregivers at some point.
Yeah. I mean, I might want to clarify your question a little bit more, but I mean, what was so clear is that, like never before, the idea that none of us parent alone became so clear, as parents were called on to be everything for their children while the schools closed down, parents, teachers, camp counselors, therapists, and it was just unsustainable. And
even more so for parents of children with disabilities, because suddenly if your child needed an OT or a speech therapist, you're not qualified to do that as a parent. You can turn on the Zoom, but you can't do all these other things.
No, for sure. And, everything sort of stopped. Well, I mean, there were some silver linings related to COVID on the medical early intervention side, in that all of a sudden we realized, we can do telemedicine. I mean, you can't do telesurgery, but I can tell you that, it did. The few silver linings, of COVID is, yes, I think it accelerated. Finally, we're doing some more telehealth type of things, and especially children with disabilities. But it's true, so many things closed down. I mean, we are seeing early research showing just that kids born during the pandemic, have delayed milestones. They seem much more delayed than their pre-pandemic counterparts, and it's not related to their mothers having COVID. It's this most likely the stress that parents are feeling related to everything going on, and it being transmitted to the children and impacting their development. So I know I didn't answer the question, but
let me ask. I do it because when you say that, but telemedicine, I mean, there's also, I think, a benefit for working parents is we've also been we've realized that we can do parent-teacher conferences, online. You can have a Zoom link and do the parent-teacher conference. You don't have to take the full day off and go in to work. But when you think about it, let me phrase it differently. What's the ideal parent nation look like?
Yeah. Well, I always say that that's the beauty of the neuroscience. I think that if you follow the neuroscience of healthy brain development, you can really understand what an ideal parent nation would look like. And just let me define what a parent nation is. A parent nation, in my definition, is, a society that values and supports the labor and love of raising the next generation, especially in the early years, and knowing that the health and well-being of children is dependent on support of their parents. And in understanding what the neuroscience says, it really says, look, learning doesn't begin on the first day of school. It starts on the first day of life. Mm-hmm. That parents and caregivers are children's first and most important brain architects, and they need and should have the support necessary, which they get none of. And that environment matters, stable, calm environment. And if you use that as a structure for understanding what the policies and norms and supports look like, you can better understand how each part of society can best support parents. Because I want to emphasize that, this support of families, a parent nation, isn't just a policy play. I mean, certainly policies play an important role, but employers play an important role. Healthcare plays an important role. Parents being allies and play an important role, but that's basically the structure.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you because, I live outside of New York City, and, so many financial services firms, that never allowed people to work from home before the pandemic. We had no choice. And these people who were, deemed sort of essential to financial services, traders, they realized they could do everything at home. And now that people are kind of, CEOs are trying to figure it out, a lot of these financial services firms, I feel, are getting it wrong, in which they're trying to force workers to go back, full-time 5 days a week for jobs that it's just not necessary. And it's, where I am, I've seen it with certain firms doing better than others, but they're causing, dads who are fully involved in their lives and moms who want to be, fully involved in their children's lives, making other choices around their careers. And so these are like corporations that aren't leading, and, a couple of them are getting it right. And, shock, some of the best employees are going to them and not staying.
Yeah.
One of the things I want to talk about is I know you're developing, it's been an amazing role, but you're developing something called a parent village. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about what you mean by that phrase, parent village. Is that where we all kind of like make margaritas and hide from our screaming kids? Is that a parent village?
Yeah. Well, it's an opportunity I always joke that I'm a surgeon, and, you never leave things up for chance. And so, at the end of the day, it's what I care most deeply about are the ideas manifesting in the world. And as you said, the lucky thing about this timing is I think a lot of people are talking about it. So maybe we'll finally get that tipping point that we need. But in the hope to manifest these ideas in the world, we put together, I have an amazing team, Heidi Stevens, this woman, Yoli Flores, and amongst other people. And we put together sort of a curriculum because we said, okay, if we want to manifest this change, what does it look like? And these parent villages are just it's a 4-part curriculum that allows groups of individuals to come together. I mean, whether it be parents or allies, people at work, organizations, or just sort of, lead dads who want a structure for what we say, finding community, forging collective identity, and fighting for change. What are, to change the narrative of that really society can and should play a role. So they come together and sort of think about the things that they want to see different in their communities or their workplace organizations. So I don't know, something as simple as, we need a lactation room, which wouldn't be for the lead dads, I guess, in our organization, or we really want to have the ability to advise our employer that, we should have more workplace flexibility, or we really want to be connected to an organization that's fighting for paid leave, or, it's really just a structure to bring people together to elevate because one of the issues, a major issue that I see in this country is that we have, up until now, ye little expectation of society playing a role in supporting us, right? We always think this is all on us, right? As a lead dad, as a lead mom, when things aren't going well, it's because we've failed, as opposed to seeing how the dearth of societal structures impacts it. So to try to reframe it and elevate the expectation, this curriculum helps shift our expectations and activate people. So
yeah, it's interesting, but the role that others play. I was at this event recently, and one of the panelists was a woman who's a PhD economist working, running a think tank, and she flat out said, if I could find a company or an employer or a nonprofit that had high quality childcare on site, I would never leave that job. And here she is, representing, I'm not going to say who she is, but representing her employer out there and saying, essentially by saying they're not really doing, their role. And it's issues like that I'd love for you to delve into a bit, because, earlier this year, we had a lot of conversations about paid parental leave. I'm all for it. I'm all for it to get men to take more leave. I'm all for it to, have lower income people to have a chance to bond more with their children. But, if COVID taught us anything, it's that, parenting challenges don't stop after the first, 6 months. Children aren't less, time consuming. They have different needs as they get older. What can companies do, if not, a big, national, what can companies do to sort of recognize this need and recognize that caregiving is essential, not just for families, but for the functioning of our economy?
Yeah, no, I love this question, because I actually think I'm quite bullish. That's a term, I guess, from your world, on the role of business, because
you are married to an economist, so you can use that term,
bullish that they can play, they're the economic engines of our country. And I always say, if they can bring their innovation and economic might to this issue, showing that what's good for parents and caregivers is good for the bottom line, I think it'll really help move the rest of society forward. And especially in this moment in time with such low unemployment and employees really, talking with their feet, right? So many, I can't remember the stat, but a number of, a huge portion of millennials said, just as that female economist said, that, look, if another company had better family-friendly policies, they would switch jobs. And, if employers start sort of acting in that way, both, instituting more family-friendly policies, which, we can talk about all of them, but I think the basic sort of buckets are, flexibility, reliability, a living wage, help with childcare, that it'll start sort of pushing the rest of society along. The truth is that employers are hurting, parents are hurting the most, right, with the lack of infrastructure, but employees are hurting too. Employers are hurting as well. So I think they can play a large role in shifting what's going on in this country. So
yeah, and I think about that, I mean, so many, all the stats, CEOs of some of the top companies, 3/4 of them are men, and of them, the majority of them had a spouse who stayed at home, and they suffer from what, any, behavioral economists would call confirmation bias. They got to where they got to because of what they did, and therefore other people should do the same. What does it take to sort of, open the eyes of corporate leaders to say, okay, you may have gotten to where you were doing what you did, but there are other pathways to success. And guess what? That was 30 years ago when you started your journey. This is a journey today. Is it enough? Like, do workers need to vote with their feet? Do engage fathers and engage working moms need to say, enough?
I think that's actually what's happening. And I'm hearing, maybe I'm having confirmation bias, but, I've been talking to a lot of people sort of in corporate America, and it feels like the narrative is shifting. There's much more discussion around this issue. And, I was even there's a group called Best Places for Working Parents. I think we mentioned they're down in Texas, and they're really helping corporations, and businesses start instituting more family-friendly policies. And it just feels like, the discussion is really bubbling up, and there's actually movement. I mean, on the policy side of things, in some ways it feels stuck, although I think we're going to start seeing movement. But I think there's active movement in corporate America, just, whether it because there's CEOs are seeing the light, or they're seeing, wow, we won't be able to actually have top talent unless we institute these things. So
one of the sections of the book that still resonates me, it was around your first husband, Don, and Don, drowned after saving 2 children at Lake Michigan. He was an acclaimed surgeon, a deeply caring man, father of 3. Yet there's a section in which he had to make these sort of elaborate reasons to sort of leave the office to see his own kids, your kids, do something, play a sport, go to ballet, whatever. And there's this wonderful line in there where he sort of gets caught by this kind of, junior physician who sort of says, oh, I'm going to mangle it now, but, oh, is this your, triple top secret meeting with Dr. So-and-so, the head of XYZ department? And he kind of blushed, but, we've in 10, 15 years, we've gotten to a point now where I think a parent would be able to put on his or her calendar, leaving for a ball game, or leaving for a ballet recital, or leaving for, middle school graduation. But what will it take to get to a point where, without suffering any sort of, work-related penalty, a father could put on his schedule, need 1 hour to walk with a teenage child to discuss, school, not a particular event, but just to be a parent? What would it take for us to get to that place as a society where a father would feel comfortable doing that?
No. And I love that you bring up the secret parenting of Don Liu, because it was just a hilarious story that was actually told at his memorial by his then nurse practitioner. But things take time, but the truth is that it's not just about policy shifts, as you say, but it's really about norm shifts. When, we tear down the secret parenting, and leaders, right? CEOs, people who are, Don was, surgeon in chief. Actually, they do a disservice by hiding it, right? But by wearing it on their sleeve proudly, that you can be a successful CEO, you can be a successful surgeon in chief, you can be a successful whatever, and also be a very involved parent. And by doing that, not only do you give permission to others to be able to say, look, parent and worker. And by having this impenetrable sort of wall between the two, you short shrift both things. And I think so. I think it's a matter of time, but the more and more men and women in leadership positions who are able to wear it proudly, I think that's how the shifts are going to occur, and people are going to be able to say, and and I've even found myself, like, I'm in a relative position of privilege. I'm a surgeon who runs a big research center, and really letting my staff know, look, I've got to go and get my nails done with Amelie, gives them permission too to say, you know what, I'm going to. So, and it doesn't mean that you don't work hard, right? This is not about decreasing efficiency or effectiveness. It's about understanding that you can be a great worker and a great parent. So,
yeah, I mean, come on, Danny. You don't need to yell at your employees in person. You can yell at them over Zoom, right?
Take that scalpel.
No, it makes me think of this. I spent some time earlier in the week with this general counsel at a gigantic financial services firm. And I was asking him, and a financial services firm has been very clear that it wants all of its workers back in the office no matter what. And I said, what have you been doing? And they said, well, I have the privilege. I'm trying to cut some people some slack, but I'll look at the metrics every week and I'll see if not enough people have been in. And if I need to get our numbers up, I'll make sure I go in 5 days a week. And I looked at him and I said, I think that's the exact wrong thing for you to do. And he said, what do you mean? I said, if you were modeling the opposite, if you were showing that you can be just as productive as a general counsel, working from home 3 days a week, we do need to meet. But, and he had just gotten done telling me how enjoyable it had been for 2 years working from home and being with his kids and saving, kind of 3 hours a day on commuting. Yet he was afraid to model. Like, I just think, like, just as you said, like, if only those leaders would model the behavior of, you can still be a productive worker. I mean, you talk about in the book of the sort of myth of the ideal worker, but you can still be a productive worker and a human being and a parent at the same time. That we don't have to have this dichotomy anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I hate to say it, but effective people are going to be effective at work and working from home. Ineffective people are going to be ineffective at both places. So why, Well,
that's why I've said this, like, it's in a company's best interest to institute these policies, because it's their highest performing workers have options, and their highest performing workers, dads or moms, are going to say, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to leave here and I'm going to get a job somewhere else that allows me flexibility. And their lowest performing workers aren't, because nobody wants to hire their lowest performing workers. So it's just not in the best interest.
I know. But towards the question that you also originally asked, it's also the stigma around, especially men and like paid leave. And the fact that it's not, often, especially, men at, in financial, service areas, et cetera, there's, they have pretty robust paid parental leaves and family leaves, but they're not taken because of sort of the stigma. And, working to shift that, I think, is important, not just, it's important on many levels, but, there's certainly a lot of science showing that if they're in a cisgender marriage, that it, decreases divorce, it increases attachment to the child, it improves if it's they're married to a woman, her sort of workforce participation, in the long run, et cetera. So there are many benefits to it. As opposed, in addition, you get to have time with the child that you brought into the world.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. We've been talking a lot about kids here in parenting, but I want to switch to retired people, because you talk about this, and I was at a conference recently in Los Angeles where it was brought up again, and I was out there. Eve Rodsky, I know the author of Fair Play, and she sort of wondered out loud, the ARP, the American Association of Retired Persons, has so much power, and she said, why isn't there something like the AACP, as in the American Association of Caring Professionals? And look, if you're retired in America, if you're living on the basic minimum Social Security, you're not living a robust life. But there is a safety net in place, and there's an acknowledgement that we need to sort of help retired people, or at least the most vulnerable retired people. That was only something that happened 50 some odd years ago, 50, 60 years ago, and it's now sort of ingrained. What's the path forward in this moment? What's the path forward for children and their caregivers to get that, basic level of support like the elderly in America enjoy?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a big argument of the book is that, we've got a huge, we've got the research case, we've got the economic case, we've got every case in the book. And what we don't have is the public and political will. And really, the only path, not the only path, but I think the path with the greatest potential for success is really that same sort of, coalition building as the AARP did. And because not only do you have to push forward these policy changes, but you have to maintain them. There are many things that pass and then roll back, as we see. So yeah, that's a lot of and that's sort of some of the origins of the parent villages, et cetera, is how do we start sort of pushing towards this in a large tent sort of way.
Yeah. Dana Suskin, surgeon, best-selling author. Thank you for being my guest on the Company of Dads podcast. I always like to give my guests the last word. Any parting thoughts?
No, other than I love what you're doing. I deliberately called my book Parent Nation. People said, what about Mom Nation? Because it, mothers, fathers, all caregivers should be have an important role in raising the next generation. So love what you're doing.
Thanks, Ron. I'll tell you a little story. My tween is put out flyers to be a babysitter, babysitter in training this summer. And instead of putting mother's helper on the flyer, she put parent helper. And when my wife said, "Oh, that's good,"
I love that.
Yeah, I could help dads too. I was like, "Oh, all right. At least change starts at home." So
I think fathers play such a huge role in how they view themselves, how they choose partners, So
thank you again, Dana, for being my guest.
Thank you so much.